Hi and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a video about a paper by Max Wertheimer on truth, published in 1934. And so soon I'm going to start to do some more videos on Kurt Goldstein and then quickly going to Merleau-Ponty to do a lot of videos on his works this year. But first I'm just kind of laying a historical groundwork. So this is a paper that may not be super well known. It's one that I really love. I think that it is so simple and readable, yet I think profound, on how to kind of tackle the topic of truth and logic, kind of in gestalt terms. This is the same framework that Max Wertheimer had in founding Gestalt theory, and aspects of this paper are found in the speech that he gave 10 years prior in 1924, which was the topic of my last video. And just for a bit of context, he published this paper after he had immigrated to America in the wake of Nazi Germany and persecution. And I think that gives a bit of context as to how kind of passionate he is in writing this paper and papers that followed, 3 papers that followed it. There was this paper on truth, the next on ethics, the next one after that on democracy, and the 4th one on freedom. So I definitely think that his personal life and his historical context played a role in the inspiration for these papers. But again, these themes were already seen kind of in truth and logic that pays attention to a lived situation. We definitely see that in his talk on Gestalt theory of 1924. So the kind of thesis of this paper mentions will to truth, and it mentions science. So that's what we see here. This is the quote, the first paragraph of the paper. The full quote of it, and each slide will be pretty much mostly all composed of direct quotes from the paper. I've put quotation marks, I think, to communicate that on all the slides, so it should be fairly clear, but I'm just going to kind of, like I did with my last video, just kind of show you the text and talk a little bit about it, but really just kind of exploring the text itself. So although the thesis, the first paragraph mentions will to truth, and the last part of the paper mentions it beautifully, I think, but actually most of the rest of the paper is really just kind of an exploration of what I would call his truth theory, or his theory of what truth is. But there are parts of the paper that really beautifully mention how he sees that the truth is not just, again, this is a big theme of the whole paper, but subjectivity versus objectivity. He ties in the subjective human experience of affect, of feelings, of choices, of attitude as part of how truth is lived. Truth is not just an isolated fact, as we'll see. He kind of discusses this. It's something that is lived. And so that's kind of his idea of the will to truth connects to that. And so I'll just read the first paragraph. Science is rooted in the will to truth. With the will to truth, it stands or falls. Lower the standard even slightly, and science becomes diseased at the core. Not only science, but man. The will to truth, pure and unadulterated, is among the essential conditions of his existence. If the standard is compromised, he easily becomes a kind of tragic caricature of himself. And then in the next part of the paper, I want to talk about, he first kind of lays out a very simplified classical definition of truth. And before I describe it, he basically says this can serve us well up to a point. It's important up to a point, but it's just this kind of simple true or false kind of idea of truth. It's either one or the other. It's black and white. And so he's not saying it's wrong, but he does say that it's inadequate. So this is what he says about it. Quote, "The scientific situation with reference to the theory of truth is complicated at present. I begin with the classical definition of truth. a point of departure that lends itself to the simplest exposition of the subject, although what I have to say applies equally to many other approaches. According to the traditional definition, it is propositions that are true and false. A statement or proposition is true, which corresponds with its object, and vice versa. A proposition is false if it fails to correspond with its object. Truth so conceived is a general quality of propositions. It is a question of the relationship between the proposition on one hand and the object on the other. And so then he raises some questions. Many new problems emerged in the criticism of this old formulation. For example, what strictly did the term correspondence mean? What could it mean? What is meant when we say a proposition should correspond with its object? Or when the question is raised as to whether reference to the object does not involve an illegitimate transition. And he'll talk kind of a little bit more about this. So he does say that this classical kind of sense of truth does serve a purpose up to a point. He says, but regardless of the necessity for changing the definition of truth in the sense of these objections, and regardless of the great importance of these changes in some respects, the claim contained in the simple form of the old definitions is in itself important enough. So he says, statistics, publications of one kind or another do contain figures that are plainly false. So there are instances where, falsity exists on a very obvious and simple level. Either true or false, it's false. In this respect, continuing with the quote, the third bullet point, in this respect there is lack of conscientiousness and worse. The standard is often lowered, especially in general statements in which whole realms of thought are disposed of on the basis of personal predispositions or of a few individual facts. Next bullet point, he says, what the old definition requires is straightforward fidelity to facts in the sense in which a proposition corresponds or fails to correspond with the facts. So there are times when people can either kind of uphold this fidelity, this truthfulness, or they don't. They might mischaracterize something in a very kind of simple and straightforward way, maybe in journalism. And so we get to the last bullet point on this slide. He says, but truth demands more. If we consider the function of truth in life, in living thought and being, then the old definition is unsatisfactory. So as we've seen before in my last video, and I explored his speech on Gestalt theory, he wants to pay attention to the lived situation. He is fairly existential without maybe calling himself that. He wants to pay attention to how, what is the function of truth in life? What is truth lived? What is the truth when we really look at a concrete situation, not just an idea on paper or a simple proposition and object? What does it mean for them to align? It's not always as simple as just saying that it's a correspondence. So he has this fairly simple example, and it's a pretty big part of this paper. He says, a man hires another to steal something out of a desk. The theft is discovered. It has been established that the second man was seen near the house. The judge, who does not know their connection, asks the first man whether he took the article from the desk. The first man answers no, gives his alibi, and is discharged. He did not take the article from the desk. His statement that he did not is true, according to the definition. Nevertheless, he lied. And I'll just read what he says next. The investigator's question to the suspect is not an isolated fact in a vacuum. So the investigator's question to the suspect, I'll continue with this quote, is an integral part of a well-defined situation in which the investigator, the suspect, and the theft form a characteristic whole. So, Gestalt, Max Wertheimer, he wants to talk about a whole. There's a whole Gestalt, a whole situation. He wants to pay attention to a whole system. The fact, the question is not isolated. It is part of the system. I'll continue with the quote. The detail that the suspect did not himself remove the valuables from the desk stands in an important and characteristic relation in the whole situation. Were the suspect really not guilty, had he nothing to do with the whole thing, then this detail would, in a new whole, have an entirely different function, a different significance, a different role. The proposition, the statement, I did not take it from the desk, corresponds with reality, but with a piecemeal reality, torn from its context, seen as just an isolated piece, blind as to its connections as a part in a related whole, or in another related whole in which the suspect appears innocent. And so throughout this talk and in his work, Wertheimer will use the word part as a vocabulary term when he's referencing like a part seen within a whole, a part related to other parts within a whole. Piece or piecemeal is a time when he's talking about someone is seeing a part just in isolation. It's like piecemeal, it's taken out of its context, that sort of thing. I know that can be confusing, so keep that terminology in mind through the rest of the slides. And then the last bullet point on this slide, the real truth must take account of any statement and equally of its corresponding object as parts of related wholes. A thing may be true in the piecemeal sense and false, indeed a lie, as a part of its whole. So as we'll see, he wants to pay attention to kind of different ways, different depths or levels of truth. Something can appear true or to be technically true, but on a deeper level, this kind of suspect's connection to the crime is not adequately described in how he answers the question. So in that sense, it is not like deeply true. So that's kind of what he's saying here. So he uses these terms to indicate different kinds of truth and falsity. So he uses big T, big F, and little f in this paper. So piecemeal truth, piecemeal falsity, which are kind of AKA like superficial truth or superficial falsity, that of appearance, that is signified by lowercase t and f. And by big T and big F, what we have called the real truth, in which the statement and its object are considered as parts in their related wholes. It's more deeply true. At some point, I'd like to talk about kind of during this video how I think what he's really saying is that we can see truth on kind of a spectrum. He kind of calls it like these different categories of either piecemeal or real truth and falsity. I think what really reading between the lines of this paper, what he's really suggesting is that there are just like different kind of, there's a scale in depth of how true or how false something is. I don't think he would really say that this is just black or white this way, but I do think that this is just kind of how he uses symbols to signify something that is more superficially true or piecemeal truth versus something that is more deeply true. He uses the word real truth. That, I think, topic is one of the most interesting parts of this paper. I think it aligns very well with a kind of spectrum of truth and a depth of truth that's not merely categorical, black and white, either or. But he doesn't so much come out and say that in this paper. Anyway, that's kind of what I just wanted to fit in somewhere in this video, my perspective on that, what I pick up from this paper. The second bullet, I'll continue with his quote. The example we have been discussing, that with the thief, is the form lowercase t, big F. For the function of truth and falsity is not a question only of the statement itself, but of the statement S and the object O as parts of their wholes. Excuse me. S and O in their roles, in their functions as parts of their wholes. The truth here does not consist only in the correspondence between the proposition and its crude, isolated object. If the object turns out to be a part in the pattern of a definite situation, then the proposition is really true when it corresponds not only with the part as such, but with the role that it plays in the whole. He continues, if each item in the situation were isolated from every other, if our world were in every instance nothing more than the sum of isolated, kind of stackable facts that don't change each other, if we had to do only with atomic facts, that's kind of what it means. Atomism I referenced in my last video on his talk on gestalt theory if you want more context on the word atomic or atomistic. then the old definition of truth, the lowercase t and f, would be adequate. If, however, these facts or data exist not in isolation, but as parts of a whole, determined by their function in this whole, then it leads to blind and false conclusions to consider them as pieces. The whole plan of traditional logic and all its rules and its general laws is set up to deal with piecemeal content in a summation relation, and for this it is adequate. So again, that last part on this slide, I'm just pointing out that Wertheimer, again, he uses the word part to speak of parts seen within their whole. He uses the word piece or piecemeal at times when he's talking about pieces being taken as isolated or merely summative, stackable, atomistic kinds of elements. So I just kind of want to go through and explain how these different symbols can be used. So lowercase t and big F, something is true in a piecemeal sense, but on a deeper level, it's false. Lowercase f, big T, something is false in appearance, but on a deeper level, true. So something is technically not true, but in communicating it, you're kind of communicating something that on a deeper level, there's truth there. And in the paper, he goes through some examples. I won't go into it too much. It's just kind of this idea that is signified there. And then the easier examples are times big T, little t, something is both thoroughly true in its appearance and also when taken in light of the whole. And big F, little f, something both appears false and it really is deeply false. Okay, so in this paper, he is disputedly saying there are levels, different senses, or different kinds of truth. And he does say, I am using the word truth for both of these kinds of senses of it. So he says that here. One may ask why we speak of two kinds of truth and not merely two kinds of data. The answer is that the two kinds of truth may deal with the same data, but that one, big T, big F, goes to the heart of the matter. It's either true or false, deeply, at the heart of the matter, while the other, little t, little f, little t or little f, remains external. So again, he's kind of describing this more in depth here. It's not simply categorical. It's some things go more to the heart and some things are more superficial. So I see this really as more of like a spectrum or a gradient, even though he doesn't really come out and say that. Namely, when the set of facts is not merely a sum, when you can't just isolate one thing that is technically true, you have to pay attention to its role in the whole. And so I think that's kind of what I try to say here on the third point of this slide. So the last point, it says, this gives us a framework to see that there can be levels to truth. It is not merely true or false in a purely objective way. And I think that's something that's really valuable from this paper, is it just has this really simplified way of communicating that we have to get past just this idea that like truth can be purely objective. It can be either right or wrong, true or false. Truth exists, but it can't just be calculated, kind of theoretically removed from a lived situation. How we find the truth, how we discover it, is by paying attention to the context. And so that's kind of what I mean by it's not simply objective. It's not removable from lived experience. It's experiential. It's existential in some way. So I think that in this paper he is defending the existence of truth, but he is kind of modifying the theory of truth that had been more kind of commonly this idea of truth is either true or false, period. Some of this is kind of hard to communicate, so I hope that I'm making sense. I'm sometimes better writing things down, so doing my best to kind of communicate my thoughts on this. So this next slide is, he's kind of raising this hypothetical question, like maybe we just have to define our terms. And he says, well, okay, what do you mean by that? In a sense, yeah, but it's not as simple as let's just define our terms. So he says, one may say that in the burglary example, for instance, the difficulty is a matter simply of variously defined concepts. We need only to define carefully and agree on definitions. Can anyone suppose that all the difficulties consist solely in the failure to define clearly? So he says the question then, what you're saying is the question is, in a given situation, in a given context, which definition is justified, correct, significant? In a context, in light of the context, which definition is justified, which context is right, and I'll just read the quote. In a context, it is not a matter of indifference, of purely subjective appraisal, which definition is to be chosen, which things are to be discussed. Structurally, this is entirely analogous to what was discussed above. So he says, yes, in a way, this is what I was saying. It's just not purely subjective. It's not just a matter of reaching a common agreement on a definition. It's that there are certain definitions, certain terms, which are logical and true based on the context. So it still just kind of comes down to paying attention to the whole, paying attention to the context in order to reach your definition. And he says on the next point, it says, the same thing applies to the problem of abstraction. There are logically bad, incorrect, misleading abstractions. So it's not simply a matter of making an analogy. It's asking, okay, how well does this analogy kind of align logically with this particular situation? Because you can make an abstraction, you can make a generalization, and in doing so, you might lose something in translation. So we have to really, it's not just about agreeing to an analogy or agreeing to a definition. There's a logic to this that we can kind of look at the situation to guide us and ask, is this a good abstraction? Is this a good definition? And this is the part of the paper where he then brings in the term gestalt. He says, all things are not interconnected in the same way. There are fields. There are questions that are relatively self-enclosed. So it's not a matter of purely subjective deciding to pick that something is analogous to something else or that this is a good definition. There are relatively self-enclosed systems. There are things that we should be paying attention to, and there are things way out in left field that do not affect the truth of the matter, if that makes sense. If to some object situations we continue to add new facts, if, say, to the fact that I was born in the year 1992, if we add to that the fact that like zebras are black and white, those two facts really do not impact each other. But to some things, when we add a new fact, it totally changes and gives us a deeper sense of truth. And so I'll just continue with his quote. If to some object situations we continue to add new facts, we see that at a particular point, the truth value actually no longer changes. And this has its own inner reasons. A gestalt, a pattern, limits itself. Whereas in general, the variation of a part demands the simultaneous variation of other parts, this no longer follows, for example, when the variation takes place outside the boundaries and the field of the gestalt. So that's basically just what I was saying. You can just kind of look at the word field. It's just this idea that there are kind of realms where things affect other things in important ways. And then there are things that maybe are outside that field that, okay, technically, maybe at one point it was all part of one thing, one universe, you know, however you want to see it. Everything might technically be connected to everything else. That does not mean that what's going on light years away from me directly applies to a particular situation that I'm kind of exploring in my lived reality, if that makes sense. He continues, the question of establishing the boundaries of a gestalt as of a practical situation is not a matter of choice, but it is subject to examination on grounds of being correct or incorrect, logical or illogical. So he says that he seems to have this really deep conviction that there is this kind of very grounded and there's just this plain logic that you can really reach this agreement of what's logical, what's worth bringing in and paying attention to, versus what's not. He seems to have this great faith really kind of in that kind of objectivity. But it's limited in this sense of objectivity by it's determined by the context. So he's not someone that's just like radically like truth is subjective, there's no such thing as truth. He's just saying that context, the situation, the lived actual situation is crucial. Next is an example of a technically true but unhelpful answer. Someone makes a serious request. Tell me the truth about this. The answer may contain many facts that are individually valid and can leave the questioner entirely ignorant of what they're trying to find out. I have failed to understand, to grasp, if I have not grasped the inner connections of the whole, the inner determining principles. So I don't really know a great example to kind of illustrate this, but yeah, just kind of imagine that you're asking me something. You want to find out how something works, and I tell you these just kind of technically true facts that are somehow maybe related to the thing that you want to learn about, but I have not helped you understand at all how it works. That's not kind of adequate to what you're trying to find out. So there's something deeper than just kind of, is a fact true or false, but does it get to the heart? He uses the word function. So there's a kind of sense of like life, a dynamism, a function, a movement. Does it adequately kind of describe what's at work in reality? That's kind of the deeper sense of truth that he's wanting to kind of inquire about. And I like how he brings up the next point. He says, the same kind of understanding is necessary in order to make a reasonable prediction. So I'm not really a math person, but you can give someone these kind of isolated like data points, like from a graph. But whether or not those data points are really getting to the heart of a function, of whether that can help you to have enough to make a reasonable prediction based on those little isolated facts, it might not give you enough to make a reasonable prediction. So that's kind of another way of illustrating that. This word function is a very important word in this paper. And as we kind of get closer to the conclusion of the paper, this is where he talks about bringing in just kind of like that a man's, this just is a word that he uses that I'll use in the sense of just a human. The truth is about a man's attitude, his feelings, his attitudes, his behavior, just as much as it is about a proposition or a fact. And I think this is a really beautiful point, and I'm really glad that he brings in this kind of human dynamic to the paper, this kind of existential message that I have no doubt was partly inspired by him seeing just the catastrophic crumbling of society around him in Germany and this loss of kind of rationality in light of people's bias and bigotry and supremacy. So I'll just read it. So it starts with the quote at the heading of the slide. Truth and falsity, indeed understanding, is not necessarily something purely intellectual, remote from feelings and attitudes. In many of the previous examples, the most important thing is not the statement, but the whole position, a man's attitude toward the thing itself. It is in the total conduct of men, rather than in their statements, that truth or falsehood lives, more in what a man does, in his real reaction to other men and to things, in his will to do them justice, to live at one with them. Here lies the inner connection between truth and justice. This is the very concluding section of the paper, and again, it's the same wording that we see at the very beginning. He very briefly touches on this thesis. It's not explored in great depth, but I think that it's such an important point. So in this very last section, he talks again about science and on the will to truth. And this is all a full direct quote. Science is rooted in the will to truth. If it is clear that science demands not only scrupulous fidelity to facts, however indispensable that is, but that it demands more, what we have here indicated by the big T. if decisions on this basis are reached with greater difficulty. Basically, if it makes it harder, if the standard is higher for scientists, if in certain scientific fields definite decisions are at present impossible for technical or for fundamental theoretical reasons, all of these considerations cannot weaken the claims of truth. Indeed, the responsibility of the scientist increases with his difficulties. The demand grows for unswerving determination in the search for truth, for that relationship to the things themselves that mean to do them justice, that wills the truth untainted by wishes or commands. So the last thing he's suggesting here is that we should abandon truth just because it is more complicated than maybe we thought it was. If it's more complicated than that classical, very simplified definition of truth he gave at the beginning. He says it only increases our responsibility to truth. It should increase the demand for determination in the search for truth. The value of truth and justice are just as important as they ever have been.